Hey, how's it going, guys? My name is Nick. Welcome back to the Sympathizer, chapter 18. This time, we are completing the recon mission. Well, completing is not really the right word. More like finishing the recon mission. There seems to be some hang-ups along the way. But yeah, this chapter is the recon mission through the jungles of Laos and Thailand to some certain extent, up to the Mekong River, where, let's not get too ahead of ourselves here. We're going to do things pretty similar to how we've been doing it up to this point. We'll go through a super bare bones summary, and then we'll hit a kind of play-by-play of the events of the chapter. There's not really too much to dive deep on this chapter, but I think that there is some interesting stuff to kind of parse through. So we'll just take a look at a theme that I think is important to kind of hone in on when you're reading a chapter like this compared to the ones that we've been getting so far up to this point. So here we go with our bare bones summary of the Sympathizer, chapter 18. The group, which has picked up some familiar faces, prepares for the recon mission. The Sympathizer gets a taste of life in the army. The affectless lieutenant meets an unfortunate end, and a firefight erupts while the group crosses the Mekong River. So like I said, we get to the Mekong River and kind of all hell breaks loose. We will cross that river, I guess, when we come to it in our play-by-play. But yeah, like I said before, this chapter is not super dense. It's really amazing. It's really fun to read, and it's really great. You know, some of the best writing in the book, I think, is up to this point in this chapter. It's just like a really great war story at this point. You know, I think part of why this book is so great is because you get so many different looks at so many different kind of genres, you know? And this one is really keying in on the kind of Vietnam War story that has become incredibly popular. You know, it's a war story, it's a story of brotherhood, it's a story of all of that kind of stuff, but it's just one small part of this book, and I think that really helps to kind of mesh everything together and make the book kind of the sum of its parts, but not in like a negative way. You know, I know that the sum of its parts is kind of used to deride things, but I think that this chapter in particular gives you a really great glimpse into the kind of talent that the author has, not just when it comes to writing, but when it comes to writing specific genre fiction. So without getting too long-winded with kind of my praise for the chapter and up to this point the book in general, let's get into a little bit of a play-by-play of the events of this chapter, and so we can kind of parse through some of the details and get into the finer nitty-gritty. Like I said before, this chapter is pretty brief, but I think it's pretty damn exciting too. The whole recon mission takes up about 10 pages of the book, which is really interesting because of how much lead up that we've been getting for this kind of segment, and for it to only take up, you know, 1/40th for the most part of this book, I think is it's important to kind of understand the way that it affects the overall story and the overall kind of where the author is choosing to kind of place the emphasis on through the story. You know, something that kind of is as monumental as this for the characters themselves really is not insignificant. I hate to say insignificant because it's definitely not, but it's not quite as meaningful and important and not quite worth the time and attention that certain other things that we've gotten up to this point have been. So we rejoin the Sympathizer in the jungles of Thailand, adjusting to life with his new comrades and preparing for the mission. We are reintroduced to the Marines from the first chapter who accosted the Sympathizer, Bon, and Mon during the fall of Saigon. This time, though, they are members of the squad that will be undertaking the recon mission. They are referred to kind of humorously, in my opinion. They're referred to throughout the chapter as the Dark Marine, the Darker Marine, and the Darkest Marine. The Sympathizer kind of points to their growing up in a coastal area or somewhere that the sun is kind of always beating down on them, so it kind of affects their complexion a little bit. Altogether, the group consists of the Sympathizer, Bone, the affectless lieutenant, the grizzled captain, a person that the Sympathizer refers to as the philosophical medic, a Hmong scout, a kidnapped Laotian farmer, a radio operator, and a heavy machine gunner, as well as the 3 Marines. We get a little rundown of each of their loadouts and general dispositions in their introduction segment, which I think is pretty fun and interesting and helps to kind of round out their characters while not, devoting too much wasted space to their characters themselves. Ever faithful, the Admiral provides the men with all the protection that they'll need during the dangerous mission. A laminated picture of the Virgin Mary for the men to wear over their heart. The group says their goodbyes at the camp, and the Sympathizer shares a really heartfelt farewell with Claude, who seems honestly genuinely concerned with the Sympathizer's safety, and he really wishes him well out there. I think the Sympathizer, this is the first time that the Sympathizer is kind of realizing how dangerous the situation actually is. I think that Claude is a pretty good barometer for the Sympathizer to kind of understand the gravity of a certain situation. And I think that this situation where Claude is kind of wishing him well, and he tells him keep the fighting to the professionals, things like that. I think that this is kind of showing the Sympathizer that this might actually be a little bit more intense and a little bit more than he bargained for. Electing to march at night to avoid unwanted attention, the group sets out under a silver moon and the recon mission officially begins. Like I said, there's only about 10 pages of actual recon mission stuff in this chapter, which I think is really interesting, but what he's able to do with so little time and so little space is really spectacular. So the Sympathizer is obviously not used to the sort of physical toll that this type of work has on the body. And after the first few hours of excitement, the labor of it all kind of comes flooding in. The group stops for some rest at a bomb crater that the Americans left, and they come across a few more during their first night of the trek. After another couple hours of marching and nearing dawn, the grizzled captain halts the group for the night, and they pick shifts for sentry duty. The Sympathizer gets the middle shift, which he says is the worst one in his opinion, and when it's his turn, he is seized by an unquenchable thirst when he realizes that nobody thought to bring along any liquor. So I think that the kind of self-medication that the Sympathizer has been using throughout the story, the alcohol and the kind of beast that is the liquor, he realizes that in the jungle there is none, and that kind of fear sparks in him some really dark, what I can only assume to be some really dark feelings. Now, if the first day of the mission is one side of the coin, then the second day and then night are the complete opposite. The Sympathizer is a hollow shell of himself throughout the march, his body and mind becoming disentangled and his perceptions of reality slipping into an extended hallucination. He comments on his night with Lana and the fact that everything from the scents to the soft loam underfoot reminds him of the evening that they spent together. He recalls her saying that he was everything that her mother would hate, but the idea doesn't really seem to bother him. He talks about how he's so used to hatred that his liver has been fattened up by it, and he thinks, what's a little more gonna hurt? As the affectless lieutenant returns from a piss break, all hell breaks loose. An explosion from a landmine rocks the camp, and the lieutenant's leg is blown clean off. The medic attempts to render care, but the conclusion is kind of foregone at this point, and the grizzled captain takes matters into his own hands and mercifully ends the lieutenant's life. Realizing that they cannot stay in the area because of the explosion and the screaming, the group carry the body of the lieutenant, with the Sympathizer carrying the disembodied leg, 2 hours away from their previous position. The Sympathizer recalls a punishment that his father inflicted on him in his youth, and about his learning of his father's death from a deacon that his father worked with. When the group finally quit their march and bury the lieutenant, the ghost of Sonny and the major return once again to terrorize the Sympathizer, taunting him about how the lieutenant will reappear in his hallucinations. The group finally arrive at the Mekong River on the following day, and each man sets about preparing for the fording. The radio man checks in with the admiral and base camp, and the Marines set to building a raft out of bamboo. In total, it would take 4 trips at a half-hour per trip for all the men to make it to the other side of the river. And while waiting, the Sympathizer recalls the philosophical medic's last words over the grave of the affectless lieutenant. All of us who are living are dying. The only ones not dying are the dead. The Sympathizer kind of takes some solace from these words, but not really anyone else is too excited about the philosophical medic's final words for the affectless lieutenant. Finally, as the grizzled captain readies himself, he alerts Bond and the Sympathizer that it's their time to go too, along with the Major and Sonny, of course. The Sympathizer contemplates the injustice of his mother never appearing to him the way that the Major and Sonny do, regardless of how many times he wishes for her presence. Just as the grizzled captain offers the bamboo paddle to the Sympathizer, his head is blown clean off by an unseen belligerent. A rocket-propelled grenade ignites the raft and sends the darker Marine into the shallows, not dead, but certainly not healthy. The ensuing firefight causes Bond and the Sympathizer to go to ground, and the Sympathizer gets kind of philosophical about how he loves life and wants to smoke one more cigarette, have one more drink, make love one more time, so he's really not ready to kind of pass on, as it were. The firefight ends, and the Sympathizer realizes that the radio man has also been killed. He looks to Bond, now crying for only the 3rd time in the Sympathizer's life that he's seen this, and he realizes that this time he's crying because of the crippling defeat, rather than the impotent rage that he kind of feels at his wife and child's death, or out of mourning for his wife and child like he did when he was at Fantasia crying to Lana. The Sympathizer realizes that his plan to save Bond worked, but only, he says, as it turned out, only from death. And that's really where the chapter ends. I think that without kind of theorizing too far in advance, I think that we're going to kind of get more Commandant stuff at this point, because a disembodied voice in the forest tells Bone and the Sympathizer to throw down their arms, which they do. I think that, and also the disembodied voice has a northern accent, something that the Sympathizer says, so I think we're going to start getting some northern Vietnamese people, which means we're going to start getting some communists, which means that the Sympathizer is going to start to interact with people that he more or less aligns with. I think because of that, we are going to start transitioning to a more possibly present tense type situation, as opposed to a past tense type situation, which will be an interesting kind of switch up from, all the stuff that we've read up to this point. It's going to be interesting to kind of see how that is balanced out and to see how that kind of progresses from this point. The thing that I wanted to kind of touch on and discuss more in detail this time is not really related. I mean, it is related to the chapter and the story in general, of course. But I think that the important thing that we get from this chapter is the glamour and the reality of war. The chapter is amazing, I think, because it provides an interesting foil for all of the Hamlet stuff that we've gotten up to this point. We get the production of the film in a closely controlled environment where there are really no consequences or dangers outside of the Sympathizer's accident, of course. But this chapter really presents us with the complete opposite angle. The men are forced to endure grueling conditions, dying randomly and unceremoniously, and they endanger themselves further with every single step they take towards Vietnam. I think that the affectless lieutenant situation just showcases the reality of war in a really dark way. It's all so random. I think that it's important for the Sympathizer to kind of be around for all of this because he's had a relatively sheltered life throughout his military service. While Bond and the other men that he's with have experienced operating in the field, as a member of the secret police, the Sympathizer never really has worked in the front lines. He's primarily been secret police, he's been in interrogation, he's been, all this other kind of stuff that's away from the kind of action of the front. as more and more bad shit starts to happen to the group, the Sympathizer seems to be the only one that's kind of having difficulties compartmentalizing everything that he's seeing. You know, his hallucinations become way more realized and persistent. His body responds negatively in a really intense ways. I'm not going to read it word for word, but there's he talks about his ears swelling and his legs hurting and all this other kind of stuff. So his body is responding negatively. And he operates with a level of fear that we really have yet to see from him. You know, he's having hallucinations that are persistent through a long period of time, right? And he's also trying to come to terms with the reality of life and death, and he's scared. You know, he's really afraid at this point. And I think that it's important for his growth as a character and his growth as a person to really be experiencing this. We're getting the story, of course, from his point of view, so the only real information about the mission itself will be in relation to him, from his perspective, of course. But from the way it's told, it seems to be that the Sympathizer is realistically the only person who's kind of unprepared for the task at hand. When the firefight erupts, the radio man is immediately shooting back into the tree line. Bone has to kind of shake him out of his fear paralysis in order to get him to start firing back into the tree line as well. When shit starts to hit the fan, the Sympathizer kind of folds a little bit. You know, he ducks his head, he prays, he's not really a war fighter that way. And I think that it's important for the story to kind of show that for all the Sympathizer is good at, you know, war is still able to turn someone who's killed even into a different person, into a different version of themselves. I think providing the reader with this kind of glamorized version of the war in this situation with the Hamlet versus the reality of the war in the recon mission, I think it's important because it's another instance of the whole man of two faces motif, right? We get the version of events and situations that we want to show to the world, and then we get the version of events and situations that are real. You know, we get the mask, and then we get the real face underneath it. You know, you want to make a movie, and you want to make a war movie, and there's explosions, and there's people getting killed, and there's disembowelments, and there's rapes happening, and all this stuff, and you know, it's all on a closed set. Everything is pretty, you know, everything is pretty controlled. Like I said, of course, outside of the Sympathizer's accident situation, that was obviously uncontrolled. Or maybe it was controlled and the Sympathizer was actually supposed to get killed by the Auteur at that point. I don't think we'll ever really know. But I think that we get a glimpse into the reality of the Vietnam War in a way that we haven't really gotten up to this point. And even though the war is over, we're still getting kind of a day-to-day life in a soldier of the war. You know, the trudging through the jungles and the crossing the rivers and the getting killed by people who are unable to be seen and stepping on landmines and, you know, being scared of walking around in the daylight. You know, I think there's a lot of stuff in here that shows us the reality of the Vietnam War and what fighting a war in Vietnam looks like. As opposed to the kind of controlled chaos that the Hamlet kind of provided for us earlier in the story. So I think that that's honestly all I've got for this chapter. It's a pretty short one. Like I said, the events of the recon mission only take about 10 pages, so I think that this chapter is only about 13 to 15 pages long, which is really not long when it comes to this book. We've had some 20 something page chapters, so I think for something like this to come this late in the book, it's super interesting. I think that this chapter was really awesome. I'm excited to see where things kind of progress to from here. Like I always say, I don't really want to do too much theorizing because I don't want to ruin it for myself. But I think that there's going to be some tonal shifts. There's going to be some maybe tense shifts. Things are going to start to happen in the present tense as opposed to the past tense. I hope we get back to America, honestly. I hope we get back to Miss Maury. I miss Miss Maury. I miss Lana. I miss I don't really miss anyone else, to be honest with you. But yeah, like I said, I think this chapter is super good. Let me know what you thought about it. If I missed anything, give me a shout. I'll be happy to talk about it in the next one. But I think that's it. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.